But another thing I would just wanted to preface, I'm not an expert in anything. I am quite literally just a person who's really passionate and have things I want to share and have things I want to get out into the world. And at this moment in time, it's really important for those of us who feel strongly about making change and being agents of change is we have to be the ripples of that change. We have to start the ripples of that change. And hopefully that's what I'm doing here today with all of you, creating change. So here's the agenda for today. In total, about an hour and a half. Hopefully it won't go too long. And if you feel like jumping early, by all means, I will not take offense. We're going to quickly go over some agreements and goals just to make sure that this is a safe and comfortable place for people to open up and feel vulnerable. We're going to watch, we're actually going to intersperse a lot of different multimedia. And today I know a lot of us are very zoomed out. I literally sit on Zooms from 7 a.m. sometimes until 9 or 10 straight. So I totally get that. So there'll be some moments where I'll want you to turn off your cameras. And my apologies, a little bit of my earlier agenda is there. We're going to be watching another video. We're going to be doing some individual reflection and journaling. We're going to be doing some really small breakouts and then coming back. Apologies, that was an old slide. The goals for today. We're really trying to build empathy and compassion for ourselves, for our colleagues, and the community. I gather that most of you touch the community rather heavily and extensively, and so compassion and empathy is, I'm sure, very much needed in your roles. You want to learn something about yourself regarding a relationship with racial bias. We want you to be able to express how you feel about these situations if you feel called to share. And eventually, we want to become more comfortable having these conversations with our inner circles and our community at large. Again, wanting to get that ripple effect going. So let's acknowledge that the space we're entering in together is as a group, and we're talking about race, and that's not always very easy. So just come with a big heart and openness, learn, listen, and just kind of understand it's going to be uncomfortable, and we'll have to lean into that discomfort. There's a lot of discomfort in society as a whole right now, and in order for us to overcome it and to come out on the other side, we kind of have to lean into that, to the hardness and the discomfort sometimes. So just some agreements I hope that we can kind of all abide by. Keep that positive intention, assuming folks are not coming here with any kind of malice or malicious intent. Focusing on our experiences, focusing on I, so the lived experience that we're going to be talking throughout. I've pulled a lot of materials from folks speaking from their own selves and from their own lives. Stay engaged as much as you can. I would love if you kept your videos on so that we could all see each other, but totally understand the dynamic. So feel free to do whatever is most comfortable for you, but please stay engaged and listen with curiosity. Again, leaning into that discomfort, knowing that we're not going to be coming to any conclusions today. This is literally a conversation starter. In the next session, next week, will actually be a little bit more about action and actually how to address and maybe even steps for overcoming bias. But today we're really just more about self-reflection and self-evaluation. And just another good rule of thumb, anytime you're in a large group, as much space as you're taking, give that much space as well. So if you're an extrovert, try to be considerate to those who are introverts and make space for everyone to be able to participate. Great. So the second thing we're going to do after the first video, first of all, had anyone seen that Procter & Gamble clip that was playing when you all came in? No? So interesting. Okay, great. I'll make sure to send that out with all the resources if it's something you might be interested in. There's a lot of, there's a discussion guide and there's a lot of content they actually created around it. But the next video that we're going to be looking at is from Dr. Joy Angela Degray. And she is special to me because she is a social worker, she is an educator, and she focuses on the intersection of racism and trauma and violence and the history of American slavery. And so she took 12 years to do quantitative and qualitative research. And she developed a theory and published a book, and it's called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And it's really a book that talks about the residual impacts and generations of slavery and opens up discussions on how the Black community can use those strengths we've gained in the past to heal in the present. And that is, I think the key word here is healing. And so everything that I'm sharing with you today are lessons or research or words or people that I've just personally encountered. Because again, I just want to establish I'm not an expert in any of these things, so we can't necessarily have a debate about the merits of what's good or bad or right or wrong. I'm just simply sharing with you my opinions and how I feel. Great. Just one second while we pull up the video.
Who's half black, half white, but looks white. Blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? This is a nice day today. They're just chatting up. And she says, yeah, so Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point, the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened I can't know for certain had the black woman said, "This is unfair. Why are you doing this to me?" Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
So that to me just exemplifies and gives some pretty stark examples of bias and also privilege.
You know, right now where we are in the world, we really need to work together. And so we have all kinds of folks trying to work
Oh, that's silly autoplay. Curious if anyone had seen that video or if anyone had any thoughts they'd like to share or impressions from watching that. Okay. Well, that's great, because the next exercise I would like for us to do is actually just kind of sit and process a little bit, because racism, racist bias, shows up in a lot of ways. It affects our interpersonal relationships. We may even have lost friendships, family, coworkers because of disagreements and fights and tension over racism. At the same time, we may have lost relationships with people of color because the tensions of racism make those relationships difficult to sustain. It distorts our racism distorts our sense of danger and safety. We are taught to live in fear of people of color. We are exploited economically by the upper class and unable to fight or even see this exploitation because we are more or less conditioned to scapegoat people of color, and that's systemic racism. Many of us are also brutalized by family violence or sexual assault and unable to resist effectively because if we've been taught that people of color are danger, never actually the white man or the white woman that we live with. That's kind of a struggle. Our feelings of guilt and shame and embarrassment or inadequacy about racism and our responses to it lower our self-esteem, because racism kind of, goes against our ideals of democracy and justice and equality, which is what we're conditioned to believe our country's based on. But it leads us to be cynical and kind of pessimistic about human integrity and our future, lacking ability to be empathetic, and we end up being kind of stuck in this analysis paralysis of not knowing what to do, and the problem is just too big to solve. And then there's also folks who don't even see that about themselves. It's hard to have conversations about how we can improve or better change society if we haven't even really sat with ourselves to kind of understand and realize what it is we need to change about ourselves. So for the next exercise, this is going to be really about just kind of self-reflection and journaling. If you have something to write with, that would be fantastic. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to present on the screen a bunch of different prompts just for you to kind of sit with and ask of yourself, especially when we're coming into a situation where people have a tendency, a natural tendency, mind you, to want to resist or to put the blinders on or to project and say, but that's somebody else, that's not me. I want you to just really kind of process some of these prompts and really sit with how racist tendencies, bias tendencies show up in your life on a daily basis. So I'm just going to keep the prompts up on the screen for a few minutes and just love for you to just kind of read through them, just sit with them, process them, and if you feel called to, even journaling or taking some notes. And we're going to do this for about 5 to 6 minutes. And I'll even just call out some just in case folks are having a hard time seeing it. More or less ask yourself these questions and see how they make you feel. I have felt embarrassed by, separate from, superior to, or more tolerant than other white people. I have worked in a job where people of color held more menial jobs, were paid less, or were otherwise harassed or discriminated against, and I did nothing about it. I've participated in an organization, a work group, a meeting, or event which people of color protested as racist or which I knew to be racist and did nothing about it. I've had degrading jokes, comments, or put downs about people of color made in my presence and did not protest or challenge them. I have felt racial tension or noticed racism in a situation and was afraid to say or do anything about it. I've seen a person of color being attacked verbally or physically and did not intervene. I live in a community where, for whatever reason, no people of color are present, so that some of those questions don't apply. I'm concerned that there is not enough attention paid to family violence and sexual assault in my community because of the focus of police and criminal justice resources on communities of color. I'm concerned that drug abuse in my white community is not taken seriously enough because disproportionate attention is on drug use in communities of color. I experience a heightened and intrusive state of surveillance and security in my neighborhood where I shop, in my school, when I cross borders, or when I use airports because of social fears of the dangers of people of color. I've had to accept unnecessary limits on my basic civil liberties because of social fears that people of color are dangerous. I have felt angry, frustrated, tired, or weary about dealing with racism and hearing about racial affairs. Any of these relate to you all? Anyone having any aha moments?
I'll say something. I think for me, I don't appear always, I mean, I appear someone who is of color, but I'm somewhat racially ambiguous because I'm Native American and my family's Mexican, but predominantly Native American and a lot of Spanish. So it's often strange to in some ways I see when exceptions are made for me because I'm not as dark as others. But I also, it's sometimes frustrating to be the only person in the room. And, you know, my particular practice area, I was like the first person of color to be practicing in my practice area statewide. So, you know, the microaggressions that I've experienced when I've pointed out issues within my community and comments such as, well, attorneys of color or law students of color aren't interested in this practice area, and the perception that there's these concepts of like people of color law versus non-people of color law. And yeah, it's exhausting, and it's sometimes scary when you're the only one in your practice area, and if you speak up, you know the consequences of that could either be favorable or it could just ruin your career, and it's exhausting.
Thank you for sharing, Mary. I'm going to share a few more prompts for folks to consider, maybe journal on the next few minutes. I don't know exactly what my European American heritage is, what my great-grandparents' names were, or what regions or cities my ancestors are from. I grew up, lived, or live in a neighborhood or went to a school or a camp which, as far as I know, is exclusively white. I grew up with people who were servants, maids, gardeners, or babysitters in my house. I did not meet people of color in person or socially before I was well into my teens. I grew up in a household when I heard derogatory racial terms or racial jokes. I've seen or heard images in magazines, on TV or radio, with Mexicans depicted as drunk, lazy, or illiterate, Asians depicted as exotic, cruel, or mysterious, Asian Indians depicted as excitable or silly, Arabs depicted as swarthy, ravishing, or crazed, African Americans depicted as violent or criminal.
Danielle,
Yes.
the slide didn't advance.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
New share. Let's make sure I'm in the right one. Apologies, they look almost identical.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, sure. I've seen or heard in magazines any character roles from non-white cultures depicted by white actors. I was told not to play with children of particular other ethnicities when I was a child. I've sometimes felt that white culture was wonder bread culture, meaning empty and boring, or that another racial group had more rhythm, more athletic ability, was better at math and technology, or had more musical or artistic creativity than mine. I have felt that people of another racial group were more spiritual than white people. I've been nervous and fearful or found myself stiffening up when encountering people of color in a neutral public situation. I've been sexually attracted to a person from another racial group because it seemed exotic or exciting or a challenge. I was in a close friendship or relationship with a person of color where the relationship was affected, stressed, or endangered by racism between us or from others. I am not in a close, significant relationship with any people of color in my life right now. I've been in a close friendship or relationship with another white person where that relationship was damaged or lost because of a disagreement about racism. I grew up in a family or heard as a child that people of color were to blame for violence, lack of jobs, or other problems.
Well, this is Marjorie Wallace.
Hello, Mark.
And hi. And I don't see those items up on the screen anymore, but I definitely know about my European ancestors. But I definitely grew up in a community where everybody was white. And I constantly heard, in fact, I remember my driver's ed teacher. That's where I learned all kinds of racial epithets that I'd never heard of before, was in my driver's ed, from my driver's ed coach teacher and in high school.
Wow.
And I didn't say anything. First of all, I was in shock. And second of all, I was afraid to say anything. But, and my relatives in Ohio, when they said racist things, I'm amazed at myself, but I did speak up. And I don't know why, but I just did. And as a kid, and they were kind of blown away. But a lot of times people have said jokes and or after the fact, I'll like hit myself on the head. Not so much now, but through the years, and think, why didn't I say something? That was so bad. And, but I have to say, I have been feeling superior to a lot of white people recently because I've been watching all these Karen YouTube videos that have just been blowing my mind. So, but I try not to, but anyway, it's hard not to. But, yes, definitely people were menial, but that's it.
I think the Karens are also an example, or I hope that your reactions to the Karens is maybe even one of self-reflection and not an immediate otherness, because
Right.
that's a little bit of how there's a spiral in our consciousness about that. We have I'm not white, so I don't want to speak for all of you, but from what I've learned and from what I understand, I just totally lost my train of thought right there. I apologize.
About the
You said you
Karens.
weren't white.
Oh, yeah. So even though, you know, I'm speaking for others, I grew up in an all-white community, so it's almost kind of like I get a sense of it. There is a tendency to, like I kind of mentioned before, otherize those around you, because whiteness is not a thing. Like race isn't even a thing. And I was even, you know, conflicted with using that word in the title and throughout our conversation today, because race is a construct. There's no scientific, biological, there literally is nothing that substantiates the use of race. But what has happened is that white has become such it's such its own thing, you know, that, but you also know where you come from, right? So you can differentiate each other by your ethnicities, even though you have the same skin color, but Black people can't. People of color don't necessarily have that privilege or that ability. So you have a much easier time saying that white person is not me. That person is not acting like me.
Right.
So you have a much easier time of deflecting. And so hopefully by watching some of those videos and kind of coming to terms with maybe even a little bit of your own Karen behavior, or being able to call it out in yourself and others, I think is extremely important. Thank you for sharing. That was very wonderful.
I'd like to share, if we have a moment, to pick up on that. My name is Sally, and I've also been trying to confront to a greater degree my own white privilege, and what I have found myself doing in the past is kind of what our last speaker talked about, which is, well, I'm one of the good ones. I live in Oakland, half my family's Black. I can like give you the laundry list, right? But that, by doing that, of comparing myself to the not as bad white people for my whole life, it hasn't stopped us from getting where we are, which is racism, white supremacy, all the terrible things that are going on. So I still have to look in the mirror and say, if I'm this great person and I surround myself with all these great people, why are we here? And the reason that's so hard to do is it brings up shame. Nobody wants to say I'm racist. Nobody wants to say I benefit from privilege. We don't want to say that about ourselves. I don't want to say that about myself. So this new phase for me of coming more to terms with just the fact that I vote right and my friends are the right color, it's, okay, let me really assume that I have benefited from white privilege, which I have. Let me assume that I have done racist things, which I have, period. If I really think about it. Can I be that and still be a good person? Yeah, I can make mistakes and I can be curious about it. I can be imperfect, I can be messy, and I can learn and grow from those things. The issue for me with the Karen situation is it makes people that are good-hearted and want to have a conversation or want to do something, like, feel like they'll be attacked or they can't. And that's why I like this space, so someone could say, hey, I'm trying to do the right thing, but why is this happening, or why do I feel this way? So we can just be curious and grow without shaming ourselves and feeling bad about ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think a lot of what's also happened, well, shame also has 3 elements: secrets, silence, and judgment. That's shame. And so ultimately, kind of how I'm perceiving our current state of affairs is the secrets are kind of these social secrets, or these, you know, communal secrets that we sort of put away. I feel like, you know, we kind of all come from, quote unquote, a very similar generation or time. I grew up being told everyone is perfect. Everyone has all kinds of potential. You can be anything you want. Everyone is the same. Nobody is different. And what that kind of represented to me, or kind of how I've seen that sort of gaslighting society, is that all of the traumas of what oppression has done to build this country and build our society kind of got, sort of pushed under the rug, kind of like a repressed memory in some sense. Like we wanted to wear the rose-colored glasses so much to the point that we stopped talking about all of the destruction and oppression and violence that created where we are. And now that it's sort of come back up to the surface, just like a repressed memory comes out, now we're having to deal with kind of like, quote unquote, those secrets, right? And now we're having that judgment. And now we're in that silence mode because we're afraid to speak out. And that's what all the shame and guilt is building on top of us. And that's exactly what we have to push away. Like, we just have to move past it. It's something that I encourage people to sit with and kind of process, because the first step to kind of getting over shame is speaking it and is talking it out loud. And this is from an Oprah episode, so I know that it's true. Oprah said it and her guest said it, so it's totally true. But that was actually one of the big points of healing around shame and moving past it, is being able to talk about it, unburdening yourself. And the most perfect place to do that is in an intimate setting, something like this, where you do have kind of in your head, you're sort of lessening your risk, right? Risk mitigation by being around folks that you feel that maybe you can be a little bit more open with. Great. So now we actually are going to talk a little bit about bias, since that's what we're here for. Great. So bias is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, a person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that is considered unfair. The main forms of bias are confirmation bias, explicit bias, unconscious bias, and implicit bias. And we're going to break that down just a little bit. But for now, I also just want to make sure we state what racism is, because I think sometimes we get a little bit confused when we say racist versus racism. So racism, this is racial prejudice. Racism is racial prejudice and institutional power together. It takes both of them in order to constitute racism. This impacts society by promoting and perpetuating cultural beliefs against people of color and systemic discrimination. So when we talk about racism, we actually mean the ideology and the systemic racism that occurs. We don't actually mean one person is racist, or an individual is racist, or a group of people is racist. That is on a case-by-case basis. Racism actually means that you're putting institutional power behind the prejudices that you actually believe. So that also means that there can't be any form of reverse racism, because marginalized people and people of color don't actually have any institutional power. Therefore, we cannot actually be racist towards the oppressor or the white folks. And I'm speaking for people of color. So I just wanted to make that clear, because I know that there can be a little bit of a confusion, and it's actually really important. So let's look at all of the different types of biases. Unbelievably, there are 10 unconscious biases, or 10 forms of unconscious bias. Selective attention. Example, a pregnant person is more likely to notice another pregnant person. Diagnosis bias, thinking all Black people act the same because of one interaction. Pattern recognition, create and sort information based off of prior experience and then setting them up as patterns. Value attribution, placing value on someone based on their identity. For example, a man is more valuable than a woman, depending on the job. Confirmation bias, proving a belief that you already have, looking for all the stereotypes of Latinos to confirm that stereotype. So going back to the first one, selective attention. selectively seeing the things that you want to pay attention to or have experienced. The best example of this, again, is the pregnant lady. The pregnant person is more likely to notice another pregnant person because they are pregnant and they're experiencing pregnancy. So you're more likely to spot another pregnant person simply because you're having that experience. Diagnosis bias is diagnosing all races regardless of the experience. So as the example shows, thinking all Black people act the same because you had one interaction with one Black person. This is a form of diagnosis bias. Now, this is not to be confused with stereotyping somebody. We're going to get into that. That's like a whole nother thing, stereotyping. But diagnosis bias is literally just having one interaction and then assuming that everybody acts that same way. And then pattern recognition, and that is creating and storing the information based off of a prior experience, and then setting that up as a pattern. Actually, an example of how pattern recognition works is, for instance, having an interaction with somebody and you're noticing certain patterns about the way that person identifies, the way that they look, and the way that they talk. And now you're starting to spot all of those same patterns from that one person onto other people who have similar identities. So this can literally happen anytime with anyone, and identity, and any identity label doesn't have to be just race or any identity, right? This is placing value on someone based on their identity. The best example is like what's showing here. This one, a man is more valuable than a woman depending on the job. And we all know what type of sexism and patriarchy is involved in this. For instance, men typically get paid more than women. They typically get more laborious jobs over women, and they are much more likely to be promoted to managerial jobs versus a woman, simply because people who are in the hiring process are placing value attribution bias onto gender confirmation bias. Again, and I don't think any of this is totally foreign to you. Great. So this is just trying to prove a belief that you already have. For instance, you might already have a stereotype about a certain group of people and you are trying to confirm that belief. That's confirmation bias. So for instance, you might be looking for all the stereotypes of Latinx people or Latinos or Latinas to confirm the stereotypes that you already have a belief of. So it's like really trying to confirm the fact that all Latinos are spicy and they're all aggressive. They all talk with an accent. So this is an unconscious bias that happens all the time. And then that builds into the priming effect. This is creating an expectation based on a belief based off of a prior experience. For example, you interview a woman for a job and how to experience. You interview a woman for a job, but now you actually think that all the women following her are going to be just as bad as she was because you had a bad interaction with her. So this is trying to prime the future experience that you're going to have with somebody simply because they fit the bill, quote unquote, or that specific identity that you had a bad experience with commits the confirmation. Now circling back to talking about confirmation bias, this is the one where you're actually committing to confirming that belief or that stereotype. So this is despite knowing that a bias is actually untrue. You actually know it's untrue. You commit to actually keeping and sticking with that bias. So now we're moving on to like a stereotype threat. Now, stereotype threat, along with another unconscious bias on the list, I believe that's actually one of the most violent and dangerous unconscious biases to have. A stereotype threat is the concern of a person that confirms a belief to be true. That actually speaks a lot to our matriarch, the Central Park Karen. We've all heard of her. She called the cops on a Black man who was simply asking her to leash her dog. And she took him as an actual threat and used that stereotype threat that she had about Black men to call the cops on him, to have the consequences of what cops do when they have interactions with Black men. So this is one of the most violent forms of unconscious bias that people have on a day-to-day basis. Anchoring bias, this one is relying heavily on a belief and holding on to it. So this one can feel very similar to commitment confirmation, but this one is actually just a little bit different. An example of anchoring bias is only people from Harvard are elite and the best, so you may only actually hire elite college graduates to fill job positions. The reason this one is actually super problematic is because institutional racism has deemed certain colleges, particularly historically Black universities, HBCUs, to not be deemed as valuable enough to have things like funding or to be deemed as valuable in society. So this is the type of institutional racism that really commits to the anchoring bias that we see. And it's pretty phenomenal, actually. A few of the HBCUs just received the largest endowments to their institutions very recently, which is very exciting. Goodness, and then moving on to the group think, and that's the ability for a group of people to influence beliefs, even if you experience the opposite. So for example, and I apologize, I don't want to make things political. However, this was just the example. You're surrounded by Trump supporters, so you become a Trump supporter to fit into the group because they must be correct if they all believe the same thing. And that actually feeds into the slavery mentality. They all had slaves, so it must be okay. Oops, I'm sorry. Should not have stopped sharing. So those are the different types of bias. And now we're going to just talk really quickly on how that shows up in the criminal justice system, because that is what is most relevant to everyone here. Great. So we're basically just going to consider, for example, the milestones in a criminal case. So these are more or less all of the steps that go along, that flow along to a trial, right? First, on the basis of a crime report, and the police investigate particular neighborhoods and persons of interest and ultimately arrest a suspect. Secondly, the prosecutor decides to charge the suspect with a particular crime. Third, the judge makes decisions about bail and pretrial detention. Fourth, the defendant decides whether to accept a plea bargain after consulting his defense attorney, often a public defender or court-appointed private counsel. And fifth, if the case goes to trial, the judge manages the proceedings while the jury decides whether the defendant is guilty. Finally, if convicted, the defendant must be sentenced. And at each of these stages, every single stage of the criminal path, implicit bias has an important impact. In each of the stages of the criminal trial process, there's overwhelming amount of research that gives us more than reason to believe that implicit biases, attitudes, and beliefs that we are directly aware of and may not endorse could actually influence how defendants are treated and judged. There was a model that was released, that was produced, and it was a simulation model that more or less accumulated the racial disparities through these five stages, through these five sequential stages, from arrest to arraignment, to plea bargain, to trial, and to sentencing. It supposed that the probability of arrest after having committed an offense is 0.50. The probability of conviction at trial is 0.75. And that effect size of implicit bias is around 0.1 at each stage. So under this model and under this simulation, for a crime with a mean sentence of 5 years and with a standard deviation of 2 or more or less, a Black criminal can expect a sentence of 2.44, almost 2.5 years, whereas a white criminal can expect just 1.4. To appreciate that full social impact, we must aggregate this sort of disparity a second time over all defendants subject to racial bias out of an approximate annual total of 20.7 million state criminal cases and 70,000 federal criminal cases. Even small percentages of variance explained lead to huge amounts of impact. We won't go into it into detail because it's certainly not my area of expertise, but the same level of accumulative bias also, plays itself out in the civil path and not just the criminal by touching all of these elements of the criminal justice system. So really just something for everyone to think about. Great, so now we're going to do a fun little experiment. Hopefully you learned a little bit. Hopefully I'm not totally preaching to the choir, since I'm sure this is something you all speak about heavily. But were there any insights or takeaways or feelings folks had? No? Okay. Cool. So now we're going to do a little experiment to try to zoom out a little bit. I did this with my work team, and I want you to hear from this woman. Her name is Ashley. She's a deputy court reporter. So you can imagine all the things that she sees and does. It's in the circuit court, so she deals with felony cases, in murder trials or plea agreements for narcotics as well. And so she's the one that logs and marks the evidence. She swears in the witnesses and arraigns the defendants. Not that that's lost on any of you, but she also started out as a 911 dispatcher. And she was interviewed on a podcast that I listened to recently, and her words were just really powerful to me, and I thought it would be really great for you to hear from her directly. So we're going to do this experiment like as if you're listening to the radio or listening to a podcast. So what I want you to do is actually turn the illumination down on your screen so you only see a black screen, but I can still totally see you. This is kind of like a panopticon sort of like accountability thing, because I want you to stay engaged and I want you to stay focused, but I want you to be able to visually tune out so that you can just hear and listen and process with your senses. Okay, so hopefully nobody's looking at me anymore and can't see me. Okay, wonderful. Just make sure I'm sharing my computer sound. Same as system. Okay, great. Volume is up.
Part of the way that you figure out what your implicit bias is by asking yourself questions, is like really examining these associations that you have. So many of us don't actually take the time to do that. And our brains are hardwired to help us navigate life and to be on autopilot and to operate unconsciously. One of the best examples of this I think I've ever seen is Dr. Nicole Lapierre, the holistic psychologist on Instagram. She always uses the example of, have you ever been driving and you're driving your car, maybe you're leaving work and you're coming home, and you get home and you have no idea how you got there? Yeah, like you've been totally on autopilot the whole way. We live a lot of our lives in this headspace. And that's great. It helps us function, right? Because your brain's ability to do that got you home safely when you were driving that car. But we're also always doing like threat assessments or just general assessments of our environment in this same way on an unconscious level. We navigate our personal relationships on an unconscious level. And this is where you really see implicit bias come in that split-second decision-making.
Ash wanted to clarify that it's not.
And that to me is really powerful, is the split decision making, which prompted me, hearing her say those words was actually what prompted me to do those first exercises for you all to sit and contemplate and take some time and not making, rash decisions or having your mind going a mile a minute. Because ultimately bias also as a result of those quick fire decisions when you're under pressure. Again, when you're just thinking on your feet. So in this time, especially after the time of COVID, where most of our society and most of us have slowed down, especially in your professions and your careers, or when you're making, these crucial decisions, just take a breath and just process a little bit more and think a little bit deeper. We're going to hear from Ashley again.
Because one of the things that I wanted to really talk about too was that when we talk about the criminal justice system and we think about the criminal justice system and racial disparities and things like that, we often think or only think of police or prosecutors or judges, but a lot of the initiation into the criminal justice system is calls for service. And what I mean by calls for service is, and I used to see this all the time when you worked in dispatch, is there's a suspicious person in my neighborhood. And when you question further, okay, well, can you tell me what they're doing that's suspicious? I don't know, just something about them's not right. And you would get calls like that, and you're like, well, and as a dispatcher, you're trying to assess the safety of the situation. If this person is suspicious, what are they doing that's suspicious? What do they look like? What are they wearing? And these questions are designed to literally just be for safety and identification. But a lot of times when you ask people these questions, they can't give you really a direct answer. I don't know. I've never seen him here before, and he just looks funny, and it was always men. I think I only took one suspicious person call about a woman, and that was an exceptional circumstance. But it would just be like people through the neighborhood, and that would actually even sometimes be people that were working legitimately for companies in the neighborhood, like companies like AAP, and they would be like, I feel like they're very suspicious. I mean, he's in an AAP truck, but I don't know that he's with AAP. Things like that. And so I think one of the things, and this is really, really important. So if you come across a situation like the Central Park situation, and something about it seems off to you, before you just immediately think, I need to call the police because this seems off to me, maybe the better question, if the situation is not immediately dangerous, is to ask yourself, what about this seems off to you? And if you can't clearly articulate a reason, then maybe you need to think about it a little more in depth.
That really just resonated. I thought that was really important. There's just one more little bit we're going to hear from Ashley, and then I'll invite you all to come back into the room and turn your screens back on.
We impute layers of meaning into words, value judgments into words. And so a lot of times you'll have words like criminal or thug, and automatically you have an emotional reaction to that. You have a value judgment to just that word. And I think part of really examining your own internalized biases is really sitting with what those reactions are without judging yourself. It's just okay. So maybe I hear the word criminal and I'm like, oh, that's a scary word to me. And I ask myself a little bit deeper, well, what do I perceive of a criminal? What does criminal look like to me? And I did do this one in my classes, and almost always in terms of gender, a criminal is a man, almost always. People very rarely conceptualize women as criminal. But, then some other things that are really important to examine, and I wanted to be sure to touch on in this conversation, is intersectionality. That's very important. So it's not always just a function of gender or race. It can also be a function of social class. You can have, a bias of social class. So, for example, and the best example of this is when you think of, white collar crime, right? There are tons of white collar criminals that have done horrible, egregious things environmentally, but also in terms of loss of human life or injuries to people. But we don't perceive of people, are you familiar with any of the Enron Scandal?
Yeah, I am. I used to be an accountant, so we learned about it.
Yeah.
I learned about it in grad school.
Yeah, the Enron Scandal is notorious in many circles for many reasons. But, from a criminal standpoint, a lot of what these CEOs and things are doing, very illegal. Insider trading, things like that, super illegal. But we don't tend to perceive people like that as criminal. And it can be something as simple as the way someone is dressed. for example, if you see someone, and this happens to me a lot, so I am heavily tattooed. I have a full sleeve and a half sleeve, several visible tattoos, but when I'm at work during the day, I'm very dressed up, you know, long sleeves, typically wearing a tie. And so nobody sees those things. And it's funny because I can notice these like the difference in reaction to me, like when, you know, I'm just kind of casually out and about in a t-shirt versus when I'm dressed up for work. And there's not I wouldn't say that it's like a significant difference, but it's definitely like a subtle difference in the way that people treat me or approach me, just based on those two things. In the past, when I've, you know, asked students and other people socially to kind of give me a description of a criminal, one of the things that people tend to associate with criminality, like visually, is tattoos, the presence of tattoos. But it can also be, you know, other indications of, outward indications of things like poverty, what we perceive someone that is quote unquote poor or impoverished, what we perceive they would look like. Intersectionality there is very important.
Great. If everyone would like to come back into the room or turn your screens on. Curious if that resonated with anyone. Ash's words on, you know, quick fire decisions.
I think one example that happened not too long ago was in Alameda, where there was a gentleman, I think it was over by the school in the East End, where the guy had come out and was dancing. And the call had gone into the dispatcher that this guy, you know, was doing something weird. And how the police reacted to that, you know, and the description that was given by, and I've never seen who it is, but I'll make an assumption it was a white woman that was calling saying, you know, here's this black man, he's out dancing in the street, you know, I'm not sure what's going on. And the dispatcher questioning, you know, did he seem drunk? Did he seem to have a mental health issue? You know, was he a danger, you know, to himself or to others? And she, you know, just continued to, I think, I guess, perpetuate, look, there's a guy, you know, he's not where he's supposed to be. And then the police, kind of in your triage, you know, the police could have come and stopped that whole process, you know, and gone down that tree had they, you know, not handled it the way they did.
Again, maybe having taken a little bit more time with their decision making and assessing the situation, right?
Yes, exactly.
You know, one thing, this is Patricia Davis, one thing that resonated for me was the statement that people don't see women as criminal as much as they see men. And that kind of bothered me a little bit. The reason why is, as a woman of color, I wondered if it was too much of a generalization. I'm wondering if people don't see women who are white as criminal or women who are black. And I have to say that as a woman of color, and I said this in many outlets, I've had to deal with bias on a daily basis. Several times, even just, I went in the grocery store and touched a bottle of aspirin and decided that I didn't want to wait in line. And I was thrown against my car by a security guard and told that I had stolen something that I didn't and had to be apologized to. Or being pulled over, I was driving in Alameda on my way to court and got an emergency phone call and pulled over and had guns drawn on me by several officers. And I was seen as criminal for a cell phone. Because to approach me with guns drawn, you assumed you were in fear of your own safety. So I appreciate everything that was said. I'm kind of concerned by that generalization that people don't see, because I think if we accept those type of generalizations, then we can't heal the problems that comes along with the mentality of institutional racism and the unconscious bias. I think some of the people, I did receive an apology from the court for the guns being drawn on me. I did receive an apology from the store, but these things continue to happen. And I'm finding more often than not that I have to explain myself
in settings that my white sisters don't have to. Even entering the courthouse, I can't tell you, I don't know how many Caucasian attorneys who are present on this Zoom have ever had to take their earrings off to have their ears checked before they can enter a courthouse, or have their wallets searched. So those things there is, I feel like I am seen as criminal if I'm entering a courtroom and I have to be checked. And those are the biases that I think we really need to dig deep in to figure out, how do we as a team of people, because everybody on this call is clearly here because they want to see change, how do we dig in and make a change so people like me and other people who, you know, may look like me or not, don't have to deal with this.
So I'm going to talk again.
I just wanted to thank you, Patanisha, for calling that out. And I really appreciated that additional build on even Ash Hobbs, the woman who was speaking kind of on that blind spot that she had. And I really appreciate you calling that out 100%. Thank you. Go ahead, Kirsten.
So, you know, I think as part of the justice system, you know, we need to involve the officers and the sheriffs, because that should never have happened to her. And as much of all of us are on this, we have to reach out to them, because they seem to be touching Ms. Davis, you know, and we have to say, that's not right. You know, why is she taking her earrings off, or her wallet searched and my wallet isn't searched?
Exactly. And that actually
I mean, we should almost be doing education for them.
Kind of reminds reciprocation. And also too, that speaks a little bit to kind of the conflict and the backlash with the conversations with in the police department, and even just in corporations in general. Everyone's going through their diversity, equity, and inclusion training, right? Everyone's going through, you know, their bias training. But if we're not changing the institutions or the environments or the situations people are going back to in their workplace or where they're surrounded by, none of that quote unquote training is going to resonate. And so, Kirsten, what you're calling out is 100% that. There has to be kind of like a groundwater approach to how we solve systemic anything, right? If you have multiple pools of water and a fish comes belly up in one pool, your initial thought is going to be, oh, maybe there's something wrong with that fish. That's sick. That fish was sick. I'm so sorry for that fish. But if more and more fish start to come up to the top of that body of water dead, you know there's something wrong with that pool of water. But ultimately, right, where does the water come from? It comes from the ground. It's the groundwater. And so therefore, it's also contaminating all of the other pools of water. So you can't clean just one pool and disinfect, or make one pool, you know, decontaminated, because ultimately, because it's the groundwater that's contaminated, it's going to seep back into all of the other pools. So we can't just solve one element of bias or racism or systemic anything without having a whole kind of holistic approach on how we're going to fully change the system. So I really appreciate you calling that out, Kirsten.
So and, I wanted to just,
yes, please.
I just wanted to add really quick what Patanisha and Kirsten just said, full circle back to the video that we saw at the beginning, when Kirsten was saying we have to stand up and tell the sheriffs, why are you looking at Patanisha's earrings? Stop it. Just like the video we saw of, I've already forgotten her name, but the African-American woman at the check stand, who they assumed obviously she was criminal because they didn't want to accept her check. But it took everyone around her to stop that. So I think that's that kind of what you said, Kirsten, to, you know, when we see it, to call it out. Anyways, I know you have lots of breakout rooms, so I don't want to take your time, Danielle. Go ahead.
This is Natasha. I just want to say something really quick. I think the other thing too is that Patanisha said she received an apology from the various offenders, and that's great and everything, but I think it shakes you to the core when something like this happens. It forever affects the way that you act or go into a setting, you know, expecting maybe the next time that this will happen again. It's also really destructive in our society and for our community, because I'm not saying Pat Nisha does this or did this or at all, but I'm saying an attorney who is discriminated in this regard will then maybe talk to another friend and say, can you imagine this is what happened to me over in Contra Costa County or Alameda County or wherever it occurred. And now it puts this sort of marked feeling on this community that this is a racist community. And maybe it's just one person who wasn't trained in implicit bias to understand how to approach these situations. And it affects a whole community in the future. And it's really destructive at the end of the day. So
I want to jump on this too, because, you know, I practice legal ethics, and the disparate treatment of lawyers, especially in the courthouse, when an attorney of color experiences, you know, having to take off their earrings, or I know of another colleague who had to prove that they really were an attorney. And if they're walking in with their client, that is embarrassing, and it automatically brings us down to a different level. And we're now not at the same playing field as, especially if it's contentious and we have a white counterpart. It's those subtle microaggressions. And then on top of that, we're talking about this age of COVID where we have to go into the courthouse. And if we are delayed and unnecessarily delayed because of the fact that, you know, attorneys of color are now having to have a higher surveillance compared to our, you know, non-attorney of color, at least they're presenting as white, you know, we're suddenly late for a hearing. And that can have an impact not only on our just general appearance before the judge, but it also can have an impact on our client's experience too. We are suddenly late for different hearings. So these little microaggressions may seem very momentary, but I do think that they have much broader implications, not just for the attorney who's experienced that moment, but, you know, that trickle down effect to how our clients perceive us, how our colleagues perceive us, because we had to stand in line a lot longer than our colleagues. It's a very subtle thing, but it's freaking huge for us. And, you know, I'm sorry that Pat Nisha had to deal with this, but it happens all the time.
You know, I like to share.
Thanks, Mike.
I know we want to take a holistic approach at solving this and tackling this, but I always say you can't fix something if you don't see it. Part of the problem of why we are here is because there's been so much this is not new. That police brutality that's happening now, all the stuff that you're seeing right now is not new. What you're seeing is frustration that finally it's like enough is enough. We're gonna stand up, because every time as a Black person or a person of color comes to speak up about this is because it's race or that's because it's race, all of a sudden now we're labeled as, oh, you're being too sensitive. Why are you pulling the race card? You know, that's too sensitive. It's like your children coming to you and telling you there's a bully at the school and you just dismiss them. Oh, there's no bully at the school. Maybe that's not what's really going on. And they're going day after day and getting beat up by this bully, having their lunch money taken by this bully. And that's what's been going on in the community. If you sat down, we have been trained, especially I'm going to count myself. We have been trained to fit in, to assimilate, to play the game, to abide by the rules, to not cause waves, to not be too far out. You know, you don't want to be labeled the angry Black man, the angry Black woman, because you stand up for your rights or you're standing up. So it puts us in someone mentioned before that it's like they're afraid to speak up now because they don't want to be labeled, you know, a certain way. We've always been afraid to speak up because when we speak up, either bad things happen to us. Either we're on the end of a rope, or we're being beaten, or we're the angry person. If you sat down, I can tell you stories that's happened to me that'll make your toes curl. How many of you have had the judge have their clerk call the state bar, look you up online to see if you're really a practicing attorney after you showed them your bar card? That's multiple times. How many of you have been in Pittsburgh, this county, and been singled out for certain treatment every time you go through security? Every single time you go through security, it's happened. And it's not just people being sensitive. Things are happening. So I think, going back to what I originally said, the first thing you have to do to tackle this is you have to see the problem. You have to understand there is a problem. And too many times, good people who don't see themselves as racist, you know, they're not racist, but you add to the problem by not calling out bad behavior when it does happen, when you do see it in your own family. So I think that we need to start with training of spotting these things, of having these conversations with people of color and actually listening to them. So I think we have to start and focus more on spotting the problem.
Thank you so much for sharing, Mike. That was phenomenal.
So I'd like to make a comment if I could.
Please, Pam.
Yeah, thank you. So, and I'm reading How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi, and the whole premise of not only that book, but I think of sort of the way his philosophy is that you're either an anti-racist or you're a racist. There is no neutrality. So if you're not out there learning and seeing and advocating, you're promoting racism. Or not necessarily you're promoting racism. You are either racist or anti-racist. And that his big point also is that everybody's so afraid to make that to come to that understanding because of the pejorative nature of the term racism, or racist rather, but that instead it's just a descriptive term. And that if you can just look at it like that, and then you can acknowledge that, yes, if I'm not being anti-racist, I'm being racist.
It is an active muscle that must be exercised and used, and you have to build up the capacity for it. And now is the time to not hold back. You know, now is the time not to be silent. And I really think that, you know, the gloves kind of have to come off, right? Because we actually, kind of speaking back to what Mike was saying, I also think one of the first steps needs to be about you as a person. You need to identify your own biases. And if you're spotting it in others, and you're spotting it out in the community, and you're spotting it out in the courtroom, first look at yourself, spot it out in yourself, spot it out in your own behaviors and your own actions and your own beliefs even. Because right now, and this is actually kind of speaking back to what, I'm so sorry, your name's blocked off, Patanisha, kind of what you called out about that, about the interview. This is the time to make mistakes. This is the time to put yourself out there. This is the time to make risks and to be loud so that we can course correct, right? This is the time for people to explore. And I'm so glad, Pam, you called out that you're reading, you know, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Kendi's amazing. And I'm really encouraging people to go on this journey, but that also requires people being able to then speak freely and make mistakes so that other people can help guide you to a different and a better way of acting, being, and doing. So I don't want people to leave this conversation, again, in like the analysis paralysis, like, it's too much, I can't do anything. Like literally wanting to make that next step, because now you've just spent 90 minutes with me just thinking about yourselves. And I've asked a lot of the same things that Mike just brought up, were all of the things that I just presented to all of you to sort of sit with and contemplate. And one last thing I wanted to call out is about white privilege, because that kind of was talked a bit about. And really what that boils down to is privilege is like a blinder, right? The privilege to not have to see things, to not have to know things, and to not have to experience things. That you can go through life super holly, jolly, bubbly, perfectly fine because you're not aware of any of those things. And that's kind of like a privilege. But because, you know, people of color, African Americans in, you know, particular, actually, I would say most marginalized societies, we have a dual conscience. And this is kind of what Mike was speaking to, because we, people of color, marginalized communities, are constantly having to be aware and to consider and to accommodate white people or anybody in power, whoever the oppressors are. We learn from a very, very young age about the dynamics of power and privilege, and the awareness of how we need to make the people in power be at ease and to be safe. And we're super, super hyper aware of that. And we're super aware of how our actions and words affect the others. But white people, white privilege, irregardless of what your ethnicity is, your bloodline, being a white person, those aren't things you ever really need to consider. Even when you're interacting with a person of color, I doubt that even a thought is going through your mind that you're taking into any consideration, you know, their elders, their history. You're not making any concessions, you know, to them, or, you know, having to tiptoe around or, you know, walk on eggshells or filter yourself or edit yourself. And people of color have to do that all the time. From the moment we walk out of our doors until the moment we're back into our own beds. And white privilege allows you to not have that sensibility and to have those blinders. And so you can kind of just walk around with that sort of unawareness. And right now, the moment is to self-actualize. Human potential cannot manifest without self-actualization. And so that's what I certainly hope this conversation kind of brought up for everyone to kind of consider, because the next step, next week, if you come back for part 2, we're going to be talking just about action. This is really all about laying the groundwork and kind of establishing, getting us kind of aligned on where we're at and kind of what the state of things are. And next week is going to be fully about what we can do about it.
Can I add one more thing? I know I talked a lot last time. I'll be brief.
Please.
You take your time. I like listening.
Absolutely.
We can't be silent anymore. And I'm not going to say it's white people that's silent. It's Black people that are silent. How many times are we sitting there and there's an inappropriate comment made by a judge, another counsel, opposing counsel, a coworker, and we like get that little feeling in our gut like, oh, and we let it go. We don't say anything. We just let it slide. We can't be silent. The problem with the police is not necessarily, I mean, you hear the few bad apples. It is the few bad apples that's causing the problem, but what is the bigger problem is the silence that allows it to happen. It's the officers who are standing by allowing it to happen. It's the silence. It's when you go to your family get together and that uncle starts to talk racist and you let it happen. Or when, you're at your job and someone says an inappropriate joke and you allow it to happen. We need to stop this behavior. We need to call it out and just be brave and stand up to it. So what? If they don't like us, what we have to say, you got to stand by the side of what's right. So that's what we need more of. People standing up to bad behavior and speaking up and not be silent.
All people, not just Black, not just white, but all people to stand up.
Everyone. Thank you, Patricia. I know we're at time, and I think Anne's been in the chat. I honestly haven't looked at the chat at all. I've been too engaged with all of you and looking in your eyes and having a real true conversation, which I'm super excited about. So I presume that we're probably gonna have to wrap things up. I'm kind of bummed we didn't, leading out of the last sort of audio, I wanted to touch a little bit on intersectionality, but I'm really glad that we actually had more of a dialogue and an open discussion. So perhaps I can incorporate the intersectionality activity into next week, because it's super, yeah, it's pretty profound. And it's, again, just another exercise for people to kind of sit and unpack and start thinking about all the ways.
We're still here.
Pardon?
I'll do.
Oh, Howard, you're not
Oh.
on mute. So intersectionality is like this other layer of self-evaluation, and realizing that there are many different layers of oppression that we're all that compound on us and affect us in all different kinds of ways. So maybe I'll just share the exercise in the follow-up materials that we share with everyone. So you'll have the deck and all the resources, etc.
Danielle, don't forget it's number 2.
Number 2.
Are you going to do the poll?
I didn't know if we had time. Is it okay if we take a little?
I think we kind of have to a little bit. You might not be able to break everybody in groups, but at least it might be an interesting. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay, great. We'll do this really quickly. Instead of doing breakout groups, if folks can, you can raise your hand.
Remember,
right?
it's number 2, right?
Pardon?
It's the second.
Oh, copy that. Got it. Can you all raise your hands like a reaction? Is that something you all can do? No.
Can you not launch it? Do you want me to launch it?
The raise your hand function?
No, the poll.
Oh, no, I got it. I was instead of
okay.
breakout groups. So why don't we do this? Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a prompt, and you're going to decide what part of your identity best applies to this prompt, to you personally. And then instead of doing breakouts, what we'll do is we'll launch the poll, and then that way folks can just see how everyone kind of responded, and just sort of see kind of where we have some alignment, or maybe folks that you can reach out to offline and connect. Okay. So the first question is, the part of my identity that I am most aware of on a daily basis is gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, socioeconomic standing or class, your religion, your ability or disability, and your race. So what part of your identity are you most aware of on a daily basis? The second question is, the part of my identity that I'm the least aware of on a daily basis is. The third question is, the part of my identity that provides me the most privilege. And the part of my identity that I feel is difficult to discuss with others who identify differently. So I'm going to launch the poll, but I want people to just kind of take some time to consider their reactions. Are you able to see all the questions?
Yeah.
Okay. The part of my identity I'm most aware of on a daily basis. Wow. It's pretty powerful. So collectively, gender seems to be the most prominent, followed by socioeconomic standing. Absolutely. second question is the part of my identity that I'm least aware of on a daily basis. That's super interesting. Anyone have any feelings or thoughts they'd like to share about their response or responses so far? Okay. Next question, the part of my identity that provides me the most privilege. Absolutely. And just another thing on that too is, you know, privilege is also a limitation, because that privilege allows you to have those blinders and allows you to sort of barricade yourself. So you're missing out on a lot, you know, if you're not totally engaged with, you know, the popular majority of this world, which is not white descendants, is not white people. The majority of this world is made of Asian descent, African, you know, diaspora, and the Latin descent. So you're missing out on a lot.
Danielle, are you able to share the results so we can see them as well, or no?
Oh, you can't see them?
No, I'm sorry. I want to interrupt you, but no, we can't see them.
Shoot, that was totally, dang, I don't know how.
And I think everybody's taken the whole poll.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I had to press end poll and then now sharing results.
Okay, perfect.
My apologies.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so gender certainly seems to be the most actionable or the most prevalent part of most folks' identities on a daily basis. You know, in socioeconomic standing of your class, that affects everything. How you get to work, you know, what do you have in the refrigerator, all of these things. The part of my identity that I am the least aware of on a daily basis. Interesting. So ability and religion are the least prevalent to folks on a daily basis. And sexual orientation, they're like right around that same area. Anyone have any thoughts on the first two questions, or how they responded, or how the questions even made them feel?
I think I'm more curious about how this would look if there were more people of color on this Zoom.
I have a comment. When I was in Hong Kong traveling, I went to a McDonald's and there was a lady in there and she was Filipino. And she was probably working there abroad in some menial job. And she was arguing with the manager at McDonald's. And she was saying that this McDonald's was very racist to non-Chinese people. It was just, they get treated horribly and all of this stuff. And I was with my husband, who is half Filipino and half Caucasian. And we looked at each other and we wanted to help her because she was definitely struggling, but we didn't know how because we had come in a little late. So we didn't know what the situation was. But it made me at that point realize that I'm in a country where I now have privilege. I look like the majority. I ethnically am the majority. You know, and all of this, and then also, but my nationality provides me a privilege in a way as well. And it was really eye-opening to see it from that point of view, you know, and also to realize that in America, I am lumped in as just Asian. Like they don't even, you know, care like what countries my family came from or anything else. It's just Asian, and everyone thinks Asian is Asian, and there's a lot of history between different Asian countries, and some Asian people hate other Asian people because they were like, you know, POWs of one or the other, and so it's just a very eye-opening thing, I think, when we travel abroad to see how other people are being treated by that country. I had a friend that is Asian, and she was studying abroad in Germany and went to this very small town, and literally a man stopped her, a German man stopped her in the middle of the street and said, "Oh my God, you are the first Asian person I've seen in real life." And he was like in his 30s. So it is something that we have to open our eyes to everywhere, every time we go somewhere, everything we do. Like, it is an educational thing constantly everywhere we go. It doesn't have to be oppressive, but it is something that when we go to a new country, we should be aware. How are people being treated in this country, and reflect? It's a good opportunity, I think.
That's a great learning. Great learning.
Yeah, this is Marjorie. I just want to say something really that really resonated with me, because when I went to India and I was at this town, Pune, where there were very few white people, and everybody was stopping me on the street because they wanted their photo taken with me. I mean, hordes of people. And and they wanted to touch my hair. And so, and I had never had that feeling before, that, I'm something exotic. And it was really amazing.
And had a positive feeling on you?
Well, I was objectified too. It was this objectification, but it was also, everybody did it so nicely, and they were, so kindly. Certainly. But it did get a little frustrating, but still, it was just a real, like, I thought about that, I have so rarely been in a situation where I was the minority in terms of my race. Definitely my gender, many, 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 many times, and in court, and, and feeling a lot of the discrimination there, but never because of my race, that I can recall, until that situation.
That's really powerful. And I'm glad it actually kind of, had more of a positive feeling, because actually what that made me think of is me being the only person of color in my community for many, 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 many years. I don't think I even went to school with another Black person until junior high. But all the time it was wanting to touch my hair, right? Because all my girlfriends had either like curly perms and, things that I couldn't do. And it was a thing with my hair. And so, yeah, but it was that feeling of objectification, but in a negative way, which tends to happen when you're kind of when you're tokenized in a situation, like when you're the only one of any kind of other. And so although that ended up being generally a positive representation of that, just something to call out as just something for folks to keep in mind, that it doesn't always feel so good on the other end. Cool. So the part of my identity that provides me the most privilege, certainly race, class, and you also have to think about, people of color in this country. I would say actually more specifically Black people, and generational wealth is something that has been more or less stolen, from us, from the Housing Authority Act to the GI Bill, to no reparations. So there are many, many elements of these identities that people of color that are compounded on folks, that are marginalized folks heavily. The part of my identity that I feel is difficult to discuss with others who identify differently.
Are we able to wrap this up a little bit? I'm sorry that at 7:30 we've gone a lot over. So Danielle, is there, I know this is a great topic and we could just keep going forever.
I'm just glad you all showed up and engaged, and this is really cool. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to play another video from Joy as a closer, and we'll end after that. So feel free to jump at any point, because once the video is over, we'll end the session. And I just want to thank you all for spending the time and the energy and your thoughts, and looking forward to next week, and hopefully you'll return.
I like to go at
Sorry.
Baltimore.
Pardon.
I like to go see movies. Everybody knows I'm a movie person, but I always go to see movies that aren't they're just fantastic kind of, you know, cinematography stuff. I don't want reality because I deal too much with reality. So I deliberately went because I at this particular time it was King Kong. My fault. I own it. I go to see King Kong, and the only reason why, of course, I had seen it, the earlier versions, but the cinematography for this new one was phenomenal. All the mechanics and all the new stuff. King Kong was doing all kind of amazing stuff. So I decided I was gonna go. So I'm in, I don't know, at Baltimore. I don't know where I am traveling, and I'm with this friend of mine named Dennis. So we go in. I didn't realize the movie was 3 hours. First of all, I had to go to the bathroom when I got in, so I had to get out. And so I'm trying to figure out when during the movie do I run out. So I decided it's a big bug scene, Jurassic bugs. I don't like little bugs, certainly don't like big ones. So I decided this is a good time to run out. So I run out, and as I'm running out, this is like the first day opening, so there's like 5 theaters of King Kong. So this guy runs out with his son, white man, he's like mid-30s, and he's got this son, looks about